On a silent March morning in 1878, under a sky that felt like it was holding its breath, a woman stepped off a train carrying nothing but a secret, a past she couldn't escape, and a price placed on her life, $40. She didn't come for love. She didn't come for hope. She came to be judged. But what happened next was something no one in that dusty Wyoming station had ever seen before. A stranger stepped forward, and instead of buying her, he gave her something far more dangerous: dignity. And sometimes, dignity hurts more than rejection.
The sky over Cheyenne was waiting. It was March of 1878. The kind of March where the snow is gone, but the grass hasn't quite figured it out yet. The earth was cracked open like an old man's knuckles. There was no wind. The horses out in the yard didn't whinny. The dogs lay flat in the red dirt. Locals know that kind of weather. It means something is coming through today. It might be good, it might be bad, but it won't be normal. I brought exactly 3 things with me when I stepped off the Union Pacific. First, a small tin box. Inside was a letter from my dead husband, a coin my mother gave me before she passed, and 3 drops of laudanum, just in case I couldn't bear it anymore. Second, a secret. I was 3 months pregnant. The heavy wool coat hid my belly for now, but it wouldn't hide it for long. Third, a number, $40. That was what I was worth. I'd heard the men talking on the train. $40 was the going rate for a standard mail-order bride in the Wyoming Territory. I locked that number in my head. I decided that was the sum total of my value. I counted 47 steps from the train platform to the station door. That's a habit you pick up when you've spent years measuring the distance to the nearest exit. I noticed the dirt. It was reddish-brown, entirely different from the black soil back in Missouri. I didn't notice the 3 men leaning against the station wall, watching me as the train pulled in. Or maybe I did, and I just didn't care anymore. Then he arrived, the man who had sent for me, Hiram Deakins. He didn't take off his hat, he didn't offer his hand, he just looked at me, up and down. There was a crowd at the station. There always is. Folks waiting for freight or just waiting for a show. Hiram gave them one. I was told she was a widow, he said. He didn't say it to me. He said it to the station master. He said it loud enough for every man in the room to hear. Station master at Kansas City wrote me she was seen in a dancing hall for 8 months. Hiram shook his head, his voice ringing out over the quiet room. I ain't paying full price for used goods. I'll take her at a discount or not at all. Somebody in the back of the crowd laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. I didn't cry, I didn't argue, I didn't defend myself. I had come to Cheyenne expecting exactly this. I hadn't come to find a husband. I had come to have the world look at me and agree with the voice in my own head. Used goods, the label fit. I stood there, a dead tree waiting for the saw. Then, a man stepped out of the crowd. He wasn't Hiram. He was taller, quieter. He had been leading a horse across the yard, minding his own business. Now, he wasn't. He didn't look at me. Not once. He dropped his reins and walked straight up to Hiram Deakins. His voice wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but it carried through that room like a gunshot. What was the full price, Deakins? Hiram blinked. He looked like a man who'd just been slapped but hadn't felt the sting yet. $40, Hawthorne. Why? The man, Hawthorne, reached into his coat. He pulled out a worn leather wallet. He opened it, slow and deliberate. He counted the coins. Clack, 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 clack. He dropped 4 $10 gold eagles onto the station master's desk. They landed right in front of everyone. I'll pay full price, Hawthorne said. He turned. He looked at Hiram. Then he looked at the crowd. Not for goods. For the lady's passage home if she wants to go. Or for her to stand here with dignity while she decides what she wants to do next. Either way, full price. He still didn't look at me. Anyone here thinks a human being has a discount rate can step up and tell me why. The room went dead. No one breathed. No one stepped up. He had just paid $40 to a total stranger, not to own me, but to force the world to let me stand upright. And standing there, staring at those 4 gold coins, I felt something twist violently in my chest. Hiram's rejection was exactly what I had expected. It made sense. It was the punishment I thought I deserved. But this stranger's money? His absolute demand for my dignity? That hurt worse. I didn't look back. You learn that early out here. If you look back, people think you want something. People think you're waiting on a parade or a handshake or a debt to be acknowledged. I didn't want any of it. I picked up my reins. My horse, an old bay gelding named Copper, blew out a breath. He was ready to go. I was too. Behind me, the station was dead quiet. The kind of quiet that rings in your ears. I could feel the eyes of 30 men burning a hole in the back of my coat. I could feel Hiram Deacon standing there, dumb and flushed. And I could feel her. I didn't know her name yet. I just knew she was standing there, frozen, staring at the 4 gold coins on the station master's desk. "Come on," I said. I didn't yell it, just said it over my shoulder. I started walking toward the street. I didn't wait to see if she followed. I just walked. I listened to my boots hitting the packed dirt. Crunch, crunch. Then a few seconds later, I heard it. A lighter step, a slight drag of a wool hem in the dust. She was following. We walked through Cheyenne like that. Me in the front, leading the horse, her about 10 paces behind. It was a cold walk. The wind was starting to pick up, blowing straight down from the bighorns. It bit through my canvas jacket. I imagined what it was doing to her thin, Eastern-made coat. But I didn't stop. I didn't turn around to offer her my jacket. Why? Because if I turned around, I'd have to look at her face. And if I looked at her face, I'd see the humiliation. The raw, bleeding edge of a woman who just had her dignity stripped and priced in public. I couldn't look at that. I ain't a savior. I ain't a hero. We reached Mrs. Eulalia Pike's boarding house. It was a sturdy square building on the edge of town. White paint peeling on the south side from the sun. A wraparound porch that creaked even when the wind just looked at it. I tied Copper to the post. I walked up the steps. She stayed at the bottom. Mrs. Pike opened the door before I even knocked. She always knew when trouble was on her porch. She was a woman in her 60s, built like a brick oven, with eyes that had seen every sin a man could invent. "Silas Hawthorne," Mrs. Pike said. She looked past me. She saw the woman standing in the dirt. "What have you brought me?" "A boarder," I said. I reached into my pocket. I pulled out more money. Not gold this time, paper and silver. I handed it to Mrs. Pike. "That's 3 months," I said. My voice was low. I didn't want the woman on the ground to hear. "She gets the room at the back, the warm one, 3 meals, hot water." Mrs. Pike looked at the money. Then she looked at me. 3 months is a long time for a stranger, Silas. "She might be carrion," I said. The words tasted like ash. I hadn't wanted to say it out loud. "I don't know for sure, but I saw how she held her coat at the station. She's protecting something. If she is, she needs time. Safety. Don't push her. Let her figure out what she's doing." Mrs. Pike's eyes softened, just a fraction. But she nodded. She slipped the money into her apron. "Tell her," I said, raising my voice just a little, "that she doesn't owe me a damn thing. Not her company, not an explanation, not her story. When she knows what she wants, she can come find me. Or she can take a train back east. Or she can walk into the mountains. It's her choice." I tipped my hat to Mrs. Pike. I walked down the steps. I passed the woman. I kept my eyes fixed on my horse's saddle horn. "My ranch is 12 miles north," I told the air between us. "Box H brand. Don't come looking for me unless you want to." I mounted up. I spurred Copper. We rode out fast. 12 miles is a long way to ride with a ghost, because that's who was sitting behind my saddle all the way home. Not the woman from Boston, but Annalise Boudreau. 4 years ago, same station, same cold wind, different man refusing her. But the exact same words, used goods, whore, discount. 4 years ago, I was 32. I was standing in that same crowd. I watched Annalise beg. I watched her cry. I watched the men laugh. and I did nothing. I stood there with my hands in my pockets, too damn scared of looking like a fool to step up. I was a coward. I let the crowd dictate my spine. 3 days later, Annalise walked back to that station. In the dead of night. She brought a small Derringer pistol. She ended it right there on the wooden platform. I saw the blood the next morning. They scrubbed it. But Wood remembers. Wood drinks it up. Every time I go to town, every time I pick up freight, I see that dark stain in the oak. I hear her begging. I feel the weight of my own silence. I rode hard. The horse was lathered by the time we crossed the creek into my pasture. The sun was going down, bleeding red across the Laramie plains. The grass was pale and dead. I didn't save the woman today. I knew that. I wasn't fooling myself. I didn't throw those $40 down because I was a good man. I threw them down because I couldn't stomach another bloodstain on the floorboards. I was paying off a debt to a corpse. I dismounted at the barn. The air was freezing now. I uncinched the saddle. I brushed Copper down in the dark. The rhythmic sweep of the curry comb was the only sound in the world. Brush. Pause. Brush. Pause. I thought about her standing in the dirt outside the boarding house. She looked fragile, like a glass bottle left out in the frost. But there was something in her jaw, a tightness. She didn't cry at the station. Annalise had cried. This woman didn't. She just locked her jaw and absorbed the blow. I walked out of the barn. My ranch was silent. 2,000 acres, hundreds of cattle, and absolutely empty. I stepped onto my porch. I looked south toward town. "You don't owe me," I whispered to the wind. "I owed you." There was no pity in Mrs. Eulalia Pike. I realized that within the first hour. If I had come here looking for a mother, I would have starved. She didn't hug me. She didn't pat my hand. She didn't offer me a handkerchief or ask me about the man who had just bought my right to breathe. She handed me a towel, a bowl of corn mush, and a little brown leather ledger. "You write it down," she said. Her voice was like dry bark. "Every penny you owe, every penny you earn, starting today." I looked at the book. It was blank. "I don't have any money," I said. My voice sounded thin, weak, like it belonged to someone else. "Then you have a debt," she said, tapping the cover of the book. "Write it down. $40. You owe it to Hawthorne. You write it so you know exactly how big the hole is. Women who don't count their own money end up counting other people's lies." I stared at her. She didn't flinch. "I used to run a hall in Denver," she said. "Just like that. Casual as talking about the weather. Back in '38. I slept with men for coin. I did what I had to do to survive. And then one day, I did something else to keep surviving. The doing didn't define me. The choosing to do different, that did." She turned and walked into the kitchen. I stood there in the hallway, the bowl of corn mush warming my cold hands. For the first time in 4 years, someone had talked about being fallen without whispering, without apologizing, without turning it into a tragedy. It was just a fact, like the weather. I went to my room. It was small. A bed, a washstand, a single window facing north. I sat on the edge of the mattress. I opened the little brown ledger. I took the stub of a pencil. Day 1. Owed $40 to S. Hawthorne. Earned $0. Writing the number made it real. It wasn't a favor anymore. It was math. And math is something a person can manage. The next morning, Mrs. Pike put me to work. She didn't ask if I wanted to. She just handed me a basket of wet laundry, heavy soaking wet wool blankets. "String 'em up," she said. I dragged the basket to the yard. The wind was stiff, cold. I reached in and grabbed a blanket. It felt like hauling a dead body. I was a city woman. Boston. My hands were used to needlepoint, not lye soap and 80 pounds of wet wool. I threw the fabric over the high line. I reached up, pulling it taut. And then, it happened. A shift. Deep inside me, just below my ribs, it felt like a small fish, turning over in a dark pool. A flutter, a tiny, unmistakable movement. My breath caught. My arms gave out. The wet wool slipped from my hands and slapped me across the chest, knocking me backward. I fell. Not hard. Just a stumble into the dry dirt. But I sat there, gasping. My center of gravity was gone. The body I had known for 29 years didn't belong to me anymore. It was shared territory. I put my hand to my stomach. Through the thick coat, through the apron, I pressed my palm against myself. It's real. I hadn't let it be real. For 3 months, I had treated the pregnancy like a rumor, a ghost, a problem that would somehow evaporate if I just ignored it hard enough. If I married a stranger in Wyoming, maybe the child would just become his, and I would never have to think about the night it was conceived. But it moved. It was alive, and it didn't care about my shame. Mrs. Pike came out to the porch. She looked at me sitting in the dirt. She looked at my hand on my stomach. She didn't rush out to help me up. "Wind's coming out of the north," she called out. "Dry and mean. Blankets will be stiff by noon. Get 'em up before they freeze." She went back inside. I closed my eyes. I took a breath, a deep, freezing lungful of northern air. I stood up. I picked up the wet blanket, and I hauled it over the line. 10 days passed like that. Routine, hard, bone-aching work, scrubbing floors, peeling potatoes, smelling the wind, learning the difference between the warm, grassy breath of the south wind and the violent, biting scream of the north. The silence of the plains started to settle into my bones. In Boston, there was always noise, carriages, shouting. Here, the silence had a texture. It pressed against your ears. On the 10th night, I couldn't sleep. My hands were raw from the lye soap. My back ached. The house was quiet. I got out of bed. I lit the kerosene lamp on the washstand. The flame flickered, throwing long, nervous shadows against the floral wallpaper. I reached under my pillow and pulled out the tin box. I opened it. The smell of old paper and dried lavender drifted out. I ignored the coin. I ignored the little glass vial of laudanum. I reached for the letter. My husband's letter. Written in 1865, just before a Confederate bullet took his lung at Petersburg. I had read it 200 times. I knew every word by heart. I used this letter as my shield. Whenever a man in Kansas City looked at me too long, I remembered this letter. I told myself I was a loyal widow. I told myself a great tragic love had ruined me for anyone else. I unfolded the delicate paper. It was soft as cloth from being handled so much. I held it close to the kerosene lamp. My dearest Ever. That's how I always read it. My middle name was Evermore, Clara Evermore Whitlock. He called me Ever, but the light hit the paper differently tonight. My eyes were different tonight. Maybe the Wyoming wind had stripped the fog out of my head. I looked at the word, E. There was a smudge, a heavy, deliberate scrape of a pen nib. He hadn't written Ever. He had written a name. And then, realizing what he was doing, he had tried to cross it out, leaving only the first letter. I stared at it. My heart didn't break. It just stopped. I brought the paper closer to the flame. I squinted. Beneath the heavy ink smudge, I could just make out the loop of an L and the tail of an I. Eliza. His brother's wife. I lowered the paper. The kerosene lamp hissed in the quiet room. 13 years. For 13 years, I had built an altar to a man who, in his final moments on earth, was thinking of his sister-in-law. I had used his love as a reason to punish myself. I had used my grief to make myself untouchable. I had walked around like a saint of sorrow, looking down on the dance hall girls, pretending I was different because I had this piece of paper. It was a lie. I wasn't a tragic widow. I was just a woman who had wasted a decade of her life on a fiction. I didn't cry. The tears wouldn't come. Instead, a laugh, a sharp, ragged, ugly sound tore out of my throat. It echoed in the small room. I had come to Cheyenne to be sold for $40 because I thought I was damaged goods. I thought I had fallen from some great height of pure, unblemished love. But I had never been on a pedestal at all. I had been standing in the dirt the whole time. I dropped the letter on the washstand. I didn't burn it. It wasn't worth the match. I reached for the little brown ledger. I took the pencil stub. My hand was shaking. Not from grief, from something else, from a sudden, terrifying emptiness. The architecture of my entire life had just collapsed. I had no past to protect anymore. I had no tragic love story to uphold. I had nothing. And having nothing meant no one could take anything from me ever again. I pressed the pencil to the paper. Day 10. Owed $40 to S. Hawthorne. Earned today 50 cents. Laundry. Realized I have been wrong about who I am. I stared at the last line. It wasn't math. It didn't belong in a ledger. But it was the truest thing I had ever written. I blew out the lamp. I lay back down in the dark. For the first time since I stepped off that train, I wasn't waiting for the axe to fall. The axe had already fallen. It had chopped down the rotten tree of my past. Now, there was just the stump, and tomorrow I was going to earn another 50 cents. I stayed away from Cheyenne. It's easy enough to do when you have 2,000 acres of Laramie grass and 100 head of cattle trying to find a way to die before spring. You keep your hands busy, you mend fences, you pull calves out of the mud, you let the wind beat your face until you're too tired to think. I gave it 3 weeks. I figured 3 weeks was enough time for a woman to heal or break or buy a train ticket back east. But out here, news travels faster than the wind. It catches rides on supply wagons. It rides shotgun with the circuit riders. Jim Halloran, the man who runs the general store in town, came out to the Box H on a Tuesday. Brought a sack of flour I hadn't ordered just as an excuse to talk. Jim is Irish, got a mouth like a rusty gate hinge, always swinging, always squeaking. "She's still there, Silas," Jim said. He was leaning against my corral fence watching me shoe a horse. I didn't look up. I just drove the nail into the hoof. Tap, tap, tap. "The Boston woman," Jim went on, undeterred by my silence. "She's paying for her board by working for Mrs. Pike. Hauls water, mends sheets. Hands look like cracked leather already, doesn't leave the house except on Sundays, doesn't talk to nobody." I twisted off the end of the nail, filed it smooth. "She ain't my concern, Jim," I said. "Right, sure, just thought you'd want to know what your $40 bought." Jim rode off. I stood in the dust, holding the rasp, looking south toward town. I told myself it didn't matter. I had paid my debt to Annalise. I had cleared the ledger of my own cowardice. The Boston woman was nothing to me. 2 days later, Hiram Deakins proved me wrong. He rode up to my porch just as the sun was dipping behind the mountains. He looked nervous. He kept his hand near his belt, though he didn't have the stomach to draw a gun on me. Hiram was a man who only fought when the odds were 10-1. I stepped out onto the porch. I didn't offer him coffee. I didn't invite him to sit. "Hawthorne," Hiram said, tipping his hat. "Deakins." He cleared his throat. "I've been thinking. About the station. About the money." I crossed my arms. I waited. "Seems to me," Hiram stammered, "since you ain't brought her out here, since you ain't, using the goods, that $40 was a bit much. I'm looking for a wife again. A proper one this time. I figure by rights, half that money should come back to me, seeing as how I placed the initial order." I didn't yell. I didn't reach for my rifle. I just walked down the steps. Slow, deliberate. I walked right up to Hiram's horse. The animal shifted, sensing the quiet violence rolling off me. I looked up at Hiram. "The money wasn't yours to begin with, Hiram," I said. My voice was a whisper. "It was hers. I just delivered it." Hiram swallowed hard. "You're a fool, Silas," he muttered, pulling on his reins. "Paying full price for a woman who won't even look at you." "Get off my land," I said. He turned his horse and rode hard. I watched him go until he was just a speck against the twilight. My hands were shaking, not from fear. From a rage so deep it felt like it was going to tear my chest wide open. The next morning, the letter arrived. One of Halloran's boys brought it out. It was a small envelope. Cheap paper. My name written on the front in a sharp, slanted, educated hand. I took it into my office. I closed the door. I sat at my father's old oak desk. I opened it. 2 crumpled, dirty $1 bills fell out. I unfolded the paper. "Mr. Hawthorne, I owe you $40. I will pay back $2 per week for my earnings with Mrs. Pike. Enclosed is the first payment. I do not expect to be forgiven the debt. Paying it is what I have instead of pride. C. Whitlock." I read it once. I read it twice. I read it 4 times. I picked up the 2 crumpled bills. They smelled like lye soap and wet wool. I didn't understand. I had specifically told Mrs. Pike to tell her the money was a gift, a ticket out, a shield. But she didn't want a shield. She wanted a ledger. She was paying it back because it was the only thing in her life she could control. And the terrifying truth was, I didn't have the right to refuse it, because refusing it would just be another man telling her what she was worth. That Sunday, I saddled Copper. I hadn't been to church in 2 years. I don't care much for preachers who talk about a God who only loves you if you're clean. But Jim Halloran had said she only left the house on Sundays. I rode into town. I tied my horse behind the blacksmith shop so he wouldn't be seen. I walked into the Methodist church 10 minutes after the service started. I sat in the very back pew, in the shadows. I didn't look at the preacher. I scanned the congregation, and there she was. 3rd row on the left, sitting next to Mrs. Pike. She was wearing a plain gray dress. Her hair was pulled back tight, and she was sitting so impossibly straight. Her spine was like an iron rod. She didn't bow her head too low during the prayers. She didn't shrink away from the women in the next pew who were giving her sideways glances. She just sat there, absorbing it, enduring it, refusing to be broken by it. I watched the back of her neck. I watched the slight rise and fall of her shoulders. I thought about Annalise. Annalise had been like a bird with a broken wing, frantically looking for someone to scoop her up. She had wanted the town to love her. She had died because they wouldn't. Clara Whitlock didn't give a damn if the town loved her. She wasn't looking for a savior. She was saving herself with cracked, bleeding hands and $2 a week. A cold spike of pure terror drove itself straight into my gut. I had been comparing her to Annalise for 3 weeks. I had prepared myself for a tragic ending. I had told myself I was just paying off a debt to a dead woman. But as I sat in that back pew, listening to the choir sing a hymn about redemption, I realized the lie I had been telling myself. If Clara didn't need to be saved, then why did I pay the money? Was it really for Annalise? Or was it because I had looked at this fierce, shattered, defiant woman on the platform and recognized a loneliness that perfectly matched my own? I was terrified, because if she didn't need me, then my money meant nothing. My noble sacrifice meant nothing. It meant I was just a man, a scarred, quiet man, falling helplessly toward a woman who might look at me and decide I wasn't worth the price of admission. Before the service ended, I slipped out the back door. I rode back to the ranch like a man being chased by wolves. I took the 2 crumpled dollar bills she had sent me. I put them in a small wooden cigar box on my desk. I closed the lid. $38 to go, I thought. I realized then that I didn't want the debt paid, because when the ledger hit 0, she would be free to walk away. And God help me, I didn't want her to leave. 35 days. That's how long I had been in Cheyenne. 35 days of hauling water, wringing out blankets, and smelling the alkaline dust of the Laramie Plains. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. The wind was howling outside, rattling the window panes in their wooden frames. The room was freezing, but I was sweating. I couldn't sleep. Not because of the wind, not because of the aching in my shoulders, because of the baby. It wasn't a flutter anymore, it was a kick. A sharp, distinct jab against my ribs, a heel, an elbow. A sudden turning over that made me gasp and grab the iron bed frame. I threw off the quilt. I stood up in my nightgown. I walked over to the washstand mirror. I turned up the wick on the kerosene lamp. I looked at myself. I couldn't hide it anymore. The curve of my stomach was round and hard. Tomorrow or the next day, Mrs. Pike was going to look at me, and she was going to know. The women at the church were going to know. The men on the street were going to know. I placed both hands on the sides of my stomach. I tried to sort out the grief in my head. I tried to put it in order, like columns in Mrs. Pike's ledger book. What hurt the least? Hiram Deacon's. His rejection was a blessing. What hurt a little more? The letter from my dead husband. The realization that my past was a lie. What hurt the most? Silas Hawthorne. The weight of his $40. The 2 crumpled bills I had sent him, knowing it would take me 5 months to pay him back. But there was something else. A weight I had been ignoring, a column I refused to balance. The child. For 3 months, I had refused to think of it as a person. It was a consequence, a sin, A dark, ugly mistake made in a moment of utter desperation back in Kansas City. I hadn't wanted to name the act. I hadn't wanted to look at the father's face in my memory. But as the baby kicked again, stronger this time, demanding to be acknowledged, the dam finally broke. I fell to my knees on the cold wooden floor. I didn't cry loud. I couldn't risk waking the house, but the tears came, fast, hot, and violent. I pressed my face into the mattress to muffle the sound. I cried for the child because it hadn't asked for this. It hadn't asked for a broken mother. It hadn't asked to be born in a place where people would look at it and see only used goods. It deserved to be loved, and I didn't know if I had any love left inside me to give it. Knock, knock. I froze. The sound came from the door. Soft, but intentional. "Child," Mrs. Pike's voice came through the wood, low and gravelly. "I heard you. I ain't judging, I'm just asking. You need company, or you need to be left alone? Either answer is fine." I stayed on my knees. I couldn't find my voice. "Company," I finally choked out. The door opened. Mrs. Pike walked in. She was wearing a heavy flannel robe, carrying a tray with 2 steaming cups of tea. She didn't look at me on the floor. She just set the tray on the washstand, pulled up the single wooden chair, and sat down. "Floor's cold," she said. "Tea's hot." I pulled myself up. I sat on the edge of the bed. I took the cup she offered. My hands were shaking so bad the cup rattled against the saucer. We sat in silence for 10 minutes. Just the sound of the wind and the ticking of the clock downstairs. I took a sip of the tea. It burned my throat. Good. I needed the burn. "I'm carrying a child," I said. I didn't look at her. I stared at the dark liquid in my cup. Once the words were out, they just kept coming. A flood breaking through the timber. 3 months. The father, I don't have a clean word for what happened. I came here to marry a stranger because I couldn't look at myself in the mirror in Kansas anymore. I thought if a man who didn't know me chose me, I could pretend I was someone else, a clean slate. When Mr. Deakins refused me, I was relieved. It was the punishment I wanted. I took a shuddering breath. But then Mr. Hawthorne paid the money, and I didn't know what to do with being paid for. I didn't know how to handle being left alone. And now, the baby is growing. I can't hide it. I have nothing. I am nothing. And I'm bringing a child into it. Mrs. Pike didn't gasp. She didn't reach over and pat my knee. She took a slow sip of her tea. "Child," she said, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "I had a baby in 1839. I looked up. "Father was the man who ran the dance hall," she continued, looking straight ahead at the peeling wallpaper. "I didn't have clean words for it either. I had her in a back room on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, I wrapped her in a blanket and gave her to a Methodist family passing through to St. Louis. I never saw her again." I stared at her. The tough, unbendable Mrs. Pike. "I don't know if it was right," she said. "I know it was what I could do. You're asking me to tell you what's right for your baby. I can't, but I can tell you this." She turned her head, her eyes locked onto mine. Fierce, unforgivingly honest. "The question of what to do with the child is completely separate from the question of whether you deserve to be treated like a person. You deserve human dignity regardless of what you decide about that baby. Anyone who tells you those 2 questions are the same is selling you something." I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 13 years. I looked down at my stomach. Slowly, deliberately, I moved my hands off the tea saucer. I placed them flat against my belly. I didn't press down to hide it. I just held it. The baby kicked against my palm, a greeting. Mrs. Pike finished her tea. She set the cup down. She stood up. "There's something else I should tell you," she said. She pulled her robe tighter around her waist. "Before I leave you to sleep." "What?" I asked. "The day Mr. Hawthorne brought you here," she said, her tone shifting slightly, "he gave me the $40. He told me to watch over you. He paid for 3 months' board, Clara. Not 1. I blinked. 3 months? "Yes." Mrs. Pike walked to the door. She put her hand on the brass knob. "And he said, and these are his exact words, child, she may be carrion. I don't know for sure, but if she is, she'll need time and safety to decide. I don't want her hurried." The room started to spin. "He knew?" I whispered. My voice cracked. "He saw?" "He saw the way you were holding your coat," Mrs. Pike said gently. "He knew, from the first minute at the station." She opened the door and stepped out into the dark hallway. "Good night, Clara." The door clicked shut. I sat alone in the lamplight. My mind raced backward. Everything shifted. The entire landscape of the last 35 days rearranged itself. He didn't stay away from the boarding house out of contempt. He stayed away out of respect. He didn't just buy me out of a humiliating moment. He bought me a fortress. He had looked at me, a pregnant, ruined woman standing in the dirt. And he hadn't seen a discount. He hadn't seen a burden. He had seen a human being who needed time. I walked over to the washstand. I picked up the pencil. I opened the little brown ledger. Day 35, owed $38. Earned today, $0. I paused. I wiped a tear from my cheek with the back of my hand. I pressed the pencil down hard. Realized, being fully seen, before I was ready to be seen, was a kind of mercy I do not know how to accept. But I will try. I blew out the lamp. I went to bed, and for the first time in months, I slept through the night. Dust hung in the air, thick, heavy, the kind of dust that takes years to settle and only a second to stir back up. It was April. The ground was finally thawing out, turning the ranch yard into a soup of red mud. I was inside. I had put it off for 2 years, but the roof in my father's old study had sprung a leak over the winter. I needed to clear the room before the rot set in. My father was Reverend Josiah Hawthorne. He had been dead since 75. I left his office exactly as it was the day his heart gave out. Books stacked on the floor, sermon notes shoved into pigeonholes. He was a good man, a loud man in the pulpit, but a quiet one in the house. He believed in a God that liked to get his hands dirty. I started with the books, hauling them out by the armful. Then I got to the bottom drawer of his heavy oak desk. It was stuck. The wood had swollen with the damp. I had to brace my boot against the frame and pull until the grain screeched and gave way. Inside was a wooden cigar box, unfinished pine, no lock. I opened it. Letters. Bundles of them, tied with dry, cracked twine. I took the top bundle out. I didn't mean to pry. I was just looking for a date, trying to figure out if it was church business or personal. I slipped the top envelope out of the twine. The postmark caught my eye first. Boston. November 1849. Nearly 30 years ago. I opened the brittle paper. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, completely different from my father's heavy scrawl. "Josiah," the letter began, "I write to you not as a fellow man of the cloth, but as a father in the deepest agony of the soul." I glanced at the signature at the bottom of the page. "Yours in Christ, Reverend Ezra Whitlock." Whitlock. The breath stopped in my throat. I stared at the name. Clara's last name. The woman sitting in Mrs. Pike's boarding house 12 miles away. I pulled up a chair. It groaned under my weight. I sat down and read the letter. Ezra Whitlock had been my father's classmate at the Yale Divinity School back in the 30s. They had kept in touch. But this letter wasn't friendly. It was a cry for help. Ezra was writing about his daughter. Her name was Abigail. "She has fallen, Josiah," the letter read. "She carries a child out of wedlock. The father is a soldier, gone to the Mexican territories. He will not return. The disgrace on my house is absolute. My congregation whispers. I ask you as my oldest friend, should a daughter be disowned for what she has done? Should I cast her out to preserve the sanctity of my pulpit? Or should I die accepting her as Christ would, though it ruins me?" My hands started to shake. Abigail, Clara's mother, the woman who had raised her in Boston. I dug frantically into the box. I was looking for my father's handwriting. I found it, a rough draft of a reply written on the back of a church ledger page. Ezra, my father had written. If you disown her, you are teaching your granddaughter that love has conditions, and she will believe it about herself for the rest of her life. There is no greater cruelty than that. Take her in, love her, and love the child she carries. The child who will not remember this choice will remember its consequences forever. I stopped reading. The room felt like it was spinning. I knew the end of this story. I had seen the results standing on the platform at the Cheyenne station. Ezra Whitlock had not listened. He had cast his daughter out. Abigail had died young. Clara had been raised by a cold family in Boston, growing up believing she was a burden, believing that love had a price tag. I looked back down into the box. There was one more piece of paper, a small, ragged scrap. My father's handwriting, but much shakier, written near the end of his life. It wasn't a letter. It was just a note to himself. If she ever comes west, be the answer her grandfather couldn't give. I dropped the paper. It fluttered to the floor. I leaned forward and put my head in my hands. The silence in the house was deafening. When I stood at the station and threw those 4 gold coins on the table, I thought I was acting alone. I thought I was paying a debt to Annalise Boudreau. I thought I was finally finding my own courage, but I wasn't. I was a ghost, fulfilling a 40-year-old promise made by a dead man. I had bought the granddaughter of Ezra Whitlock the exact thing my father had begged Ezra to give her: time, safety, unconditional grace. It was a miracle, and it terrified me. Because if this was all laid out in the stars, if my father and her grandfather had written the script before Clara and I were even born, then what were we? Just actors on a stage? I had spent the last month lying awake, thinking about the stiff curve of her spine, the way she held her chin, the proud, stubborn way she sent me 2 crumpled dollar bills. I was falling for her hard, not because of a ghost, but because of her. If I showed her these letters, it would ruin everything. She was just learning how to stand on her own feet. She was just learning that she didn't owe the world an apology. If I handed her a piece of paper that proved her grandfather had debated her worth, it would crush her. And worse, if she knew my father had asked me to look out for her, she would think my protection was just an obligation, a chore. She would think I didn't see her, only a duty, I gathered the letters. I tied the twine back around them. I put them in the wooden box, and I locked the box in the bottom drawer of the desk. I wouldn't tell her, not because I wanted to lie, but because I wanted her to choose. If she ever walked onto my land, if she ever looked at me, I wanted it to be because she decided to. Not because 2 dead preachers had arranged it. I walked out to the barn. I saddled Copper. I rode to Cheyenne. The mud sucked at the horse's hooves, slowing us down. It took 2 hours to reach Mrs. Pike's boarding house. I tied up the horse. I didn't go to the front door. I went to the kitchen at the back. Mrs. Pike was peeling apples on the stoop. She looked up. She saw my face and set the knife down. "She ain't here right now," Mrs. Pike said. "Walked over to the mercantile for thread." "Good," I said. My voice was rough, grating. "I need you to give her a message." Mrs. Pike wiped her hands on her apron. "I'm listening." "Tell Miss Whitlock," I started. I had to pause to swallow the knot in my throat. "Tell her when she's ready, not a day before. I'd like to offer her work at the ranch." Mrs. Pike narrowed her eyes. "What kind of work?" "Housekeeping? Bookkeeping, whatever she wants to do, not as a wife, not as a debt, as an employee." I looked Mrs. Pike dead in the eye. "Fair wages, fair terms. She can pack up and leave whenever she wants, and Mrs. Pike—" "Yes, Silas?" "Make sure she knows she can say no. That's the whole point. She has to know she can say no." Mrs. Pike studied me for a long, quiet minute. Then a slow, gentle smile touched the corners of her mouth. "I'll tell her, Silas," she said softly. "Your father would be proud of the man you grew into." The mention of my father felt like a knife slipping between my ribs. I didn't answer. I tipped my hat. I walked back to my horse. I rode out of Cheyenne. About 3 miles out, the town vanished behind a ridge. There was nothing but the gray sky, the red dirt, and the wind. I pulled back on the reins. Copper stopped. I sat in the saddle. I looked out at the massive, empty country. And for the first time since the day my father died, I put my face in my hands. I wept. I cried for my father. I cried for Annalise. I cried for a baby born 30 years ago in Boston who never had a chance. And I cried because I was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, desperately hoping the woman behind me would choose to catch my hand. I moved to the Box H Ranch in June. I was 6 months pregnant. The Wyoming heat was starting to bake the earth. The air smelled of sweetgrass and dust. Mrs. Pike had told me the country air would be better for the baby, better for the lying in. I knew it was an excuse. We both did. But I took the job anyway, not because of the money. Silas Hawthorne was paying me a ridiculous sum, $4 a week, just to cook breakfast and keep his ledgers. I took the job because I wanted to know who he was. He had bought me at the station. He had paid for my room. He had offered me an escape. No man does that for nothing. Men always want a return on their investment. I went to the ranch expecting to finally see the hook hidden inside the bait, but weeks passed, and the hook never came. We lived in the same house, a wide, low-slung cabin made of cedar logs. It was quiet, so quiet you could hear the floorboards breathe. I met Little Wolf on my second day. He was an 8-year-old Arapaho boy. Silas had found him shivering in a barn 2 years ago after a smallpox outbreak tore through a camp up north. Silas didn't adopt him legally. The law wouldn't allow it anyway, but he fed him, clothed him, and gave him the spare room. The boy didn't speak much English. He watched me like a hawk. I didn't force it. I didn't try to mother him. I just left half a biscuit on the edge of the kitchen table every morning. By noon, it was always gone. Eventually, he started bringing me things, a smooth river stone, a blue jay feather. And then there was Silas. We ate breakfast together every morning at 5:30. We barely spoke. It wasn't an angry silence. It was the comfortable, heavy silence of two people who had spent their whole lives being exhausted by the noise of other people's expectations. He noticed things. He noticed I couldn't reach the high shelf in the pantry anymore because of the baby. The next day, there was a sturdy wooden stepping stool by the counter. He didn't mention it. He noticed I liked my coffee weak, Boston style, cut with boiled milk. He started making it that way before I even came downstairs. And I noticed things, too. I took over his ledgers. Silas was a hard worker, but he was a terrible bookkeeper. He was losing $200 a year paying freight costs he didn't need to pay. I left a note on his desk showing the math. The next week, he changed his shipping routes. We were building a life without touching, without promises. It terrified me, because I found myself sitting on the porch at night, listening to the crickets and wishing, against every rule I had written for myself, that he would walk out, sit beside me, and take my hand. Then, the second week of July, the world ended. Silas had gone into town for supplies. I was cleaning the study. I had promised to dust the upper shelves. I opened the bottom drawer of his desk to look for a clean rag. The drawer stuck. I pulled hard. It popped open. There was no rag, just a wooden cigar box. I don't know why I opened it. Maybe because it wasn't locked. Maybe because it looked out of place. But I lifted the lid. I saw the old brittle paper. I saw the postmark. Boston. I picked up the first letter. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was my grandfather's. Reverend Ezra Whitlock. I stood there in the quiet office. I read the letter. Then I read the draft of the reply. Then I read the small, ragged note in Silas's father's hand. Be the answer her grandfather couldn't give. The blood drained from my face. My hands went numb. The letters fell to the floor, scattering across the woven rug. A ringing started in my ears, a high, desperate pitch. It was a lie, all of it. The quiet mornings, the coffee, the $40 at the station. It wasn't Silas choosing to help me. It was Silas fulfilling a church mandate, a holy chore. I wasn't a person to him. I was a project, a way for him to clear his father's conscience. I had been swapped from one tragic script to another, from a grieving widow to a saved sinner. I walked out of the house. I stood in the dirt yard. The sun was blinding. An hour later, I heard the wagon pulling up. Silas climbed down. He patted Copper's neck. He turned and saw me standing by the porch. He stopped. He knew instantly. You can always tell when a wild animal has caught the scent of a trap. "You found them," he said. His voice was flat, resigned. "You knew," I said. My voice shook. Not with tears, with pure, blinding rage. "Before I even stepped off that train, you knew who I was." "No," Silas said, taking a step forward. "Clara, I swear to God, I didn't find those letters until 3 weeks after the station. I didn't know." "But you've known for 2 months since," I yelled. The sound of my own voice startled the horses. "You've known the whole time I've been living in your house, and you said nothing." "Yes." He stopped. He didn't try to close the distance. I said nothing. "Why?" I demanded, gripping the porch rail so hard my knuckles went white. "Did it make you feel good? To look at the poor, ruined Whitlock girl and know you were doing exactly what your daddy told you to do? Am I a charity case, Silas? Am I just a debt your family owed mine?" Silas stood in the dirt. He looked at me. His eyes were dark, full of a pain I couldn't comprehend. "I didn't tell you," he said, his voice dropping low, "because I didn't want you to feel exactly the way you're feeling right now." "You took away my choice," I screamed. "I came here thinking you respected me. I started to think, against my better judgment, that I actually wanted to stay, not as an employee, as something else. But now, how do I know if I want to stay because I care for you, or because I've been swept into a story 2 old preachers wrote before I was born?" Silence rushed back into the yard. Silas took off his hat. He crushed the brim in his large, calloused hands. "Clara," he said. The rhythm of his voice changed. It wasn't defensive. It was utterly defeated. "I need to tell you something I haven't told anyone in 4 years." I stood frozen on the porch. And then, standing in the Wyoming sun, Silas Hawthorne stripped his soul bare. He told me about Annalise Boudreau. He told me about the station, the crowd, his silence, the blood on the floorboards. "When I paid that $40, Silas said, tears finally welling in his eyes, tracking through the dust on his cheeks, "I wasn't thinking about my father's letters. I was paying a debt to a dead woman I failed to save. I was a coward, Clara." He took 1 step closer to the porch. "When I found those letters 3 weeks later, I panicked. I thought, is this all just a game? Am I just walking a path laid out for me by dead men? I didn't tell you because I needed to know the answer for myself first." "And what is the answer?" I whispered. Silas looked up. He looked at my face. He looked at the curve of my belly. "It doesn't matter if the path was laid," he said fiercely. "I am the man who walks it. Every morning I choose to walk it. Yesterday you laughed at a bird little Wolf pointed at. The day before you fell asleep in the chair with ink on your fingers. None of that was in my father's letter. None of that was Annalise." He reached out, his hand hovering over the porch rail, not touching me, just offering. "That's you. And I choose you, today, tomorrow. And if you pack your bags and leave me tonight, I will still have chosen you. The past didn't make me love you, Clara. You did." I couldn't breathe. I looked at the massive, scarred man standing in the dirt, offering me the one thing no one had ever given me: complete, unconditional surrender. I turned around. I walked into the house. I didn't leave that night. I spent 3 days making my decision. I needed to know it was mine. On the first night, I packed my bag. I sat on the bed in the dark, but I didn't walk out the door. On the second night, I lit a lamp and wrote a letter to my aunt in Boston. I told her I was having a child. I told her I forgave her for the coldness of my childhood. I sealed it. I was done carrying her shame. On the third night, I took my grandfather's letter out of the box. I walked to the cast-iron stove in the kitchen. I opened the door, and I threw it into the flames. I kept the letter from Silas's father. The next morning, I walked out to the kitchen at 5:30. Silas was already there. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in 3 days. He had a cup of coffee waiting on the table, weak, cut with boiled milk. I walked over. I sat down across from him. I wrapped my hands around the warm clay mug. I looked at him. "Good morning, Silas," I said. He closed his eyes. A long, shuddering breath left his chest. "Good morning, Clara." And just like that, the ghosts were gone. The house belonged to us. I didn't just sit on the porch and wait for her to break my heart. That ain't my way. Out here, you don't wait for the winter to freeze your cattle. You cut wire, you move the herd, you do something, even if it's the wrong thing. I knew Clara might leave. Finding those letters had shaken her to the bedrock. Yes, she drank the coffee. Yes, she stayed the week. But a woman's mind is a deep well, and I knew she was still staring down into the dark, trying to figure out if she could trust the water. So I prepared for her to go, not by pulling away, by making sure she had a road paved when she walked out. The second week of August, I saddled Copper and rode into Cheyenne. I didn't go to the saloon. I went straight to the Laramie County Courthouse. The clerk was a sweaty, balding man named Higgins. He looked at me over his spectacles when I pushed a map of my land across his desk. "I need to carve out a parcel," I said. Higgins wiped his forehead. "Selling, Silas?" "Deeding, 200 acres. The north section right along the creek. Has timber, has the Sweetwater Spring." Higgins whistled. "That's the best grazing land you got. Who's the buyer?" "Ain't a buyer." I pulled a folded piece of paper from my breast pocket. "Under the Homestead Act. Putting it in a new name. Miss Clara E. Whitlock. Clean title, independent of the Box H." Higgins stared at me. He knew the rumors. The whole town knew the rumors. But he looked at my jaw, saw that it was locked like a steel trap, and decided he liked his teeth right where they were. He dipped his pen in the inkwell. It took an hour. I paid the filing fee. I took the heavy parchment deed, stamped in red wax, and walked it straight over to the Cheyenne Bank. I handed it to the teller. "Put this in the vault," I told him. "If Miss Whitlock ever comes in here asking to leave town, you hand her this envelope. No conditions, no waiting period." I walked out of the bank. The sun was hot, baking the boardwalks. I felt lighter. It wasn't a romantic gesture. I wasn't trying to buy her love with dirt and water. It was an apology in the only language a man like me knows how to speak. It was me saying, if you leave, you won't leave with nothing. You won't go back to Boston. You won't be poor. You will own a piece of this earth. I untied my horse. But I wasn't done. I rode over to the livery stable. Hiram Deakins was there, looking over a roan mare. When Hiram saw me walking up the aisle, his face drained of color. He dropped the horse's leg. He stepped back, bumping into the stall door. His hand twitched toward his hip, but he didn't have a gun on him. "I ain't looking for blood, Hiram," I said. I stopped 10 feet away, kept my hands clear of my belt. "Then what do you want?" he stammered. "I came to say something." I looked at him, really looked at him. He was just a scared, bitter man, a man who let the crowd dictate his spine. "What you did at the station, I know why you did it." Hiram blinked. "You were afraid," I said softly. "You were afraid you'd get tricked, afraid the town would laugh at you. I want you to know, I'm not better than you. I almost did the exact same thing 4 years ago to another woman. I stood in a crowd and let her burn because I was a coward." Hiram's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "I just got one more chance than you had, Hiram," I said. "That's the only difference between us. If you ever want to talk about it, I'm at the Box H, that's all." I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. But 3 weeks later, the rumors in Cheyenne started to dry up. The whispers stopped. I never asked why. When I got back to the ranch that night, the house was quiet. I went into my study. I lit the lamp. I pulled out a stack of blank paper, and I wrote. I wrote 8 pages. I wrote down everything about my father's letters. I wrote about Annalise. I wrote about why I paid the $40. I wrote about the exact moment I realized I wasn't doing it for a ghost anymore, but because of the way Clara tapped her pencil against her teeth when she balanced the ledgers. I didn't write a love letter. I wrote a record. "You are not the sole reason I am alive," I wrote on the last page. "If you leave, I will not sell the ranch. I will not drink myself to death. I will raise Little Wolf. I will work. You are allowed to walk away without carrying the responsibility of my survival. But if you stay, you will never walk alone again." I sealed the pages in a thick envelope. The next time Mrs. Pike came out to check on Clara, I gave the envelope to her. "Give this to her," I told Mrs. Pike. "Only if she ever asks why, or if I'm dead." A week passed. It was late July. I was walking up from the barn at dusk. The sky was turning a deep bruised purple. I stopped by the corner of the house. Clara was sitting on the porch. The lantern was lit beside her. She had Mrs. Pike's ledger in her lap. But she wasn't doing math. She was writing, fast, furious, pages of it. I watched from the shadows. She paused. She set the pencil down. And then she placed both hands on her belly. It was large now, unmistakable. She rubbed her stomach slow and gentle, and she smiled. She was talking to the baby, whispering to it. I felt a tightness in my chest, a fierce, sudden ache. For the first time since my father died, someone was building a future on this land. Not just surviving the winter, not just holding onto a memory. They were planting something new in the dirt. I didn't step onto the porch. I didn't interrupt her. I just turned around, walked back to the barn, and stood in the dark. I didn't cry. I just stood perfectly still, letting the realization wash over me. I had prepared for her to leave. But God help me, I was going to do everything in my power to make her want to stay. September came. The heat broke, leaving behind a crisp, biting chill in the mornings. The cottonwoods along the creek turned the color of struck matches. I was heavy. 8.5 months. My back ached constantly and my feet swelled if I stood at the stove too long. Silas didn't say a word about it. He just quietly dragged a rocking chair from the parlor out onto the porch. He put a thick wool blanket over the back. One evening, after Little Wolf was asleep, I went out to the porch. Silas was sitting on the top step. He was whittling a piece of pine, not making anything in particular, just making shavings. I sat in the rocking chair. It creaked under my new weight. I pulled my shawl tight around my shoulders. The air smelled of wood smoke and coming frost. "Silas," I said. His knife stopped. He didn't look up, but his whole body went perfectly still, waiting. "I need to tell you what I've decided," I said. My voice was calm, calmer than I had felt in 10 years. "I want to have this baby here, on the ranch, with you and Little Wolf and Mrs. Pike present." He slowly set the knife down on the step. "But," I continued, "I am not going to marry you before the baby is born." The silence stretched out. A long, heavy cord. I looked at the back of his neck, at the collar of his faded canvas shirt. "Not because I don't want to," I said softly, "but because if we marry before, I will always wonder. I will wonder if you married me because of your father's letter, because of your guilt over Annalise, because of some deep, twisted sense of obligation. And you will always wonder if I married you because I was a desperate pregnant woman with nowhere else to go." He turned his head. He looked at me in the lantern light. "I want us to have the baby first," I told him. "Name her, raise her together for a year, under this roof. And then, if we still want to marry, we marry because we've chosen a life that already exists. Not to start one, not to hide from the town." I held my breath. It was a radical thing to say, a dangerous thing for a woman in 1878 to propose. Society would crucify me, but I didn't care about society anymore. I cared about the truth of the man sitting on the steps. Silas looked at the dirt. He looked at the pine shavings. Then he looked up at me. His dark eyes were shining. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that is the most reasonable thing anyone has ever said to me." He nodded. "Yes." That was it. No grand romantic speeches. No falling to his knees. Just a single word that meant he respected my mind as much as he cared for my heart. October hit the Laramie Plains like a hammer. The first blizzard blew in on a Tuesday, and with the snow came the pain. It started low in my back, a dull, grinding ache that tightened into an iron band around my stomach. Silas rode through the blinding snow to fetch Mrs. Pike. He brought her back in the wagon, nearly killing his horses to do it. The birth was not a quiet, beautiful thing. It was blood. It was sweat stinging my eyes. It was 14 hours of screaming into a leather strap Mrs. Pike gave me to bite down on. It was the brutal, terrifying reality of a frontier cabin where women died every day doing exactly what I was trying to do. Silas didn't come into the bedroom. Men didn't do that. He stayed out on the porch in the freezing cold for 14 hours. Little Wolf sat beside him wrapped in a buffalo robe. They didn't speak. They just listened to the wind, and they listened to me. At 3 in the morning, the iron band snapped. A sharp, furious cry pierced the air in the cabin. I fell back against the soaked pillows. My vision was blurry. The room smelled of copper and wood smoke. "A girl," Mrs. Pike said, her voice exhausted but triumphant. She quickly wiped the child down, wrapped her in a flannel blanket, and laid her on my chest. She was tiny, red-faced, perfect. "Abigail," I whispered, touching her dark hair. "Abigail Eulalia Whitlock." After I was clean and the bed was changed, Mrs. Pike opened the bedroom door. Silas was standing there. He looked like he had aged 5 years in a single night. There was snow on his boots. His face was gray. He took his hat off. He walked to the edge of the bed. He looked down at me. Then he looked at the little bundle in my arms. "Hold her," I whispered. Silas swallowed. "I don't. My hands are rough, Clara. I've been working wire." "Hold her, Silas." I lifted the bundle. Silas tentatively reached out. His massive, scarred hands slid under the blanket. He lifted the baby. He brought her to his chest. He stood there, stiff as a board, afraid to breathe. Abigail opened her eyes. They were dark blue. She looked up at him. Silas didn't cry, but his jaw trembled. He leaned his head down until his lips were inches from the baby's forehead. He whispered, so quietly I barely caught the words. "Little one," he said, "I am not your father. Your mother will tell you the whole story when you're old enough. But I am here. I will be here." He closed his eyes. "You don't owe me anything for that. It's not a payment. It's not a debt. It is what I choose to do. Because you are a person, and you arrived here, and that is enough." He kissed her forehead. "Full price. No discount. Ever." Lying there in the bed, exhausted, broken open, and entirely rebuilt, I finally wept. They weren't tears of sorrow. They were the tears of a woman who had spent 29 years wearing a price tag she hated, finally watching it burn to ash. 1 year later, October 1879. The kitchen was quiet. The sun was just starting to crest over the bighorns, spilling pale gold light across the pine floorboards. I sat at the table, a cup of coffee, weak with boiled milk, steamed by my elbow. Abigail was asleep in her cradle by the stove. She was 1 year old, a wild, happy thing with my dark hair and a laugh that sounded like water over stones. I opened the ledger. It was the third book Mrs. Pike had given me. The first 2 were full. I picked up the pencil. Day 578, owed $0. Earned today a life. Realized full price was never $40. It was the right to be seen without a discount. He paid that. I paid it back. We still pay it to each other every single morning. I drew a heavy dark line under the words, "This ledger is closed." I shut the book. I pushed it to the center of the table. I didn't need it anymore. Outside in the yard, Silas was standing by the corral fence. Little Wolf, now 9 years old and shooting up like a weed, was leaning against the rails next to him. Silas was holding a small leather-bound book, his father's journal. He pointed to a line on the page. Little Wolf traced the English letters with his finger. "Love with conditions," the boy read aloud, stumbling over the syllables. "Is not love," Silas finished for him. His voice was steady. "It is commerce." Silas looked down at the boy. He ruffled his dark hair. Then he looked toward the kitchen window. He saw me standing there. He smiled, a slow, easy smile that reached his eyes. An hour later, we hitched the wagon. We drove into Cheyenne. The town hadn't changed much, but we had. People on the boardwalks tipped their hats to Silas. They nodded to me, not out of pity, out of respect. We walked up the steps of the Laramie County Courthouse. It wasn't a grand ceremony. I didn't wear white. I wore my best blue wool dress. Silas wore a clean canvas shirt and his good boots. We stood in front of the judge. Mrs. Pike stood to my left, holding Abigail. Little Wolf stood to Silas's right. And in the back row of the empty courtroom stood Hiram Deakins. He had ridden out to the Box H a week prior and asked to come. Silas had left the decision to me. I had said yes. The judge cleared his throat. If anyone has any objection to the joining of this man and this woman, let him speak now. The room was silent. Then Hiram took a step forward. He took off his hat. "No objection," Hiram said. His voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls. He looked directly at me. And I was wrong at the station. I say it in front of everyone. I was wrong. I turned. I looked at the man who had publicly priced me like damaged goods. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the need to crush him. I just nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Deakins," I said. "I accept." It wasn't a romantic reconciliation. It was a legal act of the soul. I was dropping the final weight, letting it go. The judge stamped the paper. Silas Hawthorne looked at me. He took my calloused, ink-stained hand in his. He didn't say, "I saved you." I didn't say, "You rescued me." We just leaned in, and we kissed. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, so more stories like this can find their way to you. 4 years later, 1883. The Union Pacific train tore across the Laramie Plains, a black iron beast belching smoke into the wide blue sky. In the passenger car, a traveling salesman leaned his head against the glass window. He was bored. He watched the endless stretch of sagebrush and red dirt roll by. Then the train rounded a bend and a homestead came into view. It was a beautiful piece of land, a sturdy log house, a wide porch, a creek running clear through the pasture. The salesman watched the people in the yard. An older man, broad-shouldered and graying at the temples, was hammering a rail on the corral. A woman in a blue dress was pulling heavy wool blankets off a clothesline, moving with a sure, steady balance. A teenage boy, dark-haired and tall, was leading a spotted pony in a circle. On the pony sat a little girl, laughing, and chasing a yellow dog through the dust was a toddler, a boy no more than 2 years old. The salesman didn't know their names. He didn't know the teenage boy was now legally named Thomas Joseph Hawthorne. He didn't know the toddler was named Josiah Ezra, after 2 grandfathers whose sins had finally been forgiven. He just saw 5 people moving together, working in a rhythm that didn't require words. The kind of rhythm that only forms over a long time, or through something much deeper than time. The train blew its whistle, a long, mournful sound that echoed across the plains. The people in the yard didn't stop working. They didn't turn to look at the train. They didn't wave. The salesman leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes as the ranch vanished into the dust behind them. They had been called many things at the station all those years ago. Used goods, discount, charity case, fool. Tonight, as the sun went down over the Laramie Plains, no one called them anything at all. The land did not need names for them. They had become, finally, simply what they were. 2 people who had paid full price for each other, not in dollars, not in gold, but in the harder currency of seeing, of staying, of choosing each other again every single morning. And somewhere along the way, they had finally stopped counting. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
Out here on the open plains, where the wind never asks who you were yesterday, only who you choose to be today. Stories like this don't end with a grand victory or a perfect kind of happiness. They end quieter than that. They end with two people waking up in the same house, on the same piece of land, choosing, again and again, to stay. What we witnessed was never about a man rescuing a woman, or a woman being saved from her past. It was something far rarer. It was about two broken people refusing to let the world define their worth. Clara arrived believing she had a price, a number whispered by strangers, confirmed by rejection, and carved deep into her own heart. $40. That was all she thought she was. And Silas? He was a man carrying the weight of silence, of a moment when he failed to act, when fear made him small, and that failure haunted him like a ghost that would not rest. But life, especially out here in the West, has a way of stripping things down to their truth. No titles, no past reputations, no illusions, just choices. Silas didn't buy Clara. He bought her time. He bought her space. And more than that, he demanded that the world allow her to stand with dignity, not because she had earned it, not because she was pure or blameless or worthy in the eyes of others, but because she was human, and that alone was enough. And Clara, she did something even harder. She chose not to be saved. She chose to stand on her own feet, to repay what she could, to rebuild her sense of self not through someone else's kindness, but through her own labor, her own decisions, her own truth. She didn't run toward love out of desperation. She walked toward it slowly, carefully, making sure that when she stayed, it was because she wanted to, not because she needed to. That is the heart of this story, not love that rescues, not kindness that demands repayment, but a kind of human connection built on freedom, on respect, on the terrifying, beautiful act of seeing another person fully and still choosing them. The lesson here isn't loud, but it runs deep. Your worth is not decided in a single moment of failure. It is not measured by what others say about you in your worst hour. It is not something that can be discounted, bargained, or reduced to a number. Real worth is something you reclaim, piece by piece, choice by choice. And real love, it isn't about saving someone. It's about standing beside them while they learn to save themselves, and never once making them feel like they owe you for it. In the end, Clara and Silas didn't build their life on debt, or guilt, or obligation. They built it on something far stronger. They chose each other freely, every morning, without price, without condition. And maybe that's the quiet truth this story leaves us with. The greatest thing we can give another person isn't love that binds them, it's love that lets them stand.